So last season, I flew to New Orleans to do an episode about the origins of jazz music. And that was a lot of fun. I got to reconnect with some friends from college, and I got to listen to a lot of amazing music. And while I am not flying to New Orleans for this episode, I will say that we are bringing back the tradition of jazz for this episode, although this time we're talking about a specific instrument within that tradition, the saxophone. I'm Sidelbia. This is Sidelbia Snippets, and let's get right into the episode. Welcome to Sidelbia Snippets, Season 2. God, I don't know why my asthma always strikes right as I start recording. Anyways, when it comes to jazz, there is one name that you really have to know. I mean, there are multiple, but when it comes to the origins of jazz, specifically jazz saxophone, there is one really important person, Sidney Bechet. Now, some context as to why he is so important. You see, in the early 1900s, the saxophone existed, and a lot of different variations of the saxophone existed. However, it was not taken seriously nor seen as a serious instrument. It was used in a lot of comedy or vaudeville, not to the same scale of prestige that it's known to have today. But then figures such as Sidney Bechet came around. He was born in 1897, making him one of the first serious jazz saxophonists. And he played in what is called the New Orleans jazz style, which is one of the earliest types of jazz music. And he is arguably one of the reasons that we take saxophone so seriously today, or it's so well respected as an instrument. However, he is not the only jazz saxophonist, as saxophone has a long tradition with the jazz tradition, and with that has come many famous names such as Coleman Hawkins, and Charlie Parker, later followed by Lee Konitz. Lester Young is another huge name. Lester Young was a member of Count Basie's band, who was in the swing tradition, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But Lester Young also helped shape the bebop tradition in the 1940s, which is another subgenre of jazz, and cool jazz in the 1950s. And by the time he was working on music in the 1940s, the saxophone was an established and well-respected instrument. The first genre or tradition of jazz that allowed saxophone to really thrive and that allowed it to be respected as an instrument was swing, or also called big band. And there were two big names associated with it who were famous saxophonist players, Johnny Hodges and Coleman Hawkins. Johnny Hodges was born in 1907, and Coleman Hawkins was born 1904. Now, to be clear, they weren't the only people doing this in this genre. They were just some of the most famous people for their saxophone playing specifically. Other groups and bands that really allowed the saxophone to thrive within the big band / swing band tradition were the Glenn Miller Orchestra, the Woody Herman Band, and most famously, Duke Ellington's band. Now, in the Woody Herman Band, the saxophonist that is sort of most well known is Stan Getz, who later became a famous figure in the cool jazz scene and is a name that probably your average jazz saxophonist will know and envy his style of playing. This is not at all, however, where the story of the saxophone ends in jazz. Later on, it can be seen in West Coast jazz being led by the musician Jerry Mulligan, and it continues on and on and on. Now, before we get to the guest for this episode, I want to take a second to talk about one of the most famous stories or moments in jazz history involving the saxophone. And that involves the piece Giant Steps by John Coltrane. Now, I actually played this song back when I was in jazz band in high school, but I played it on electric guitar, and I think we actually did like a punk rock version of it. Either way, it was definitely the most challenging thing I had ever played on the guitar. However, I, as a guitarist, was not the intended audience to challenge with this piece, as it was actually intended to be specifically difficult and challenging to tenor saxophonists. And to be clear, he didn't do this to spite some other saxophonists. He did it because he was a saxophonist. In fact, John Coltrane is probably one of the most famous saxophone players ever, if not one of the most famous jazz musicians ever. He did it to prove to others and himself what was capable on the saxophone and really just how impressive he as a musician was and what the expansive possibilities of the saxophone were. Anyways, if you take anything away from this podcast, like literally anything, just go listen to John Coltrane's Giant Steps. And there are a couple really interesting YouTube videos and articles that analyze the song. We won't be going into all that today, but it is one of those pieces of music that still to this day blows my mind. And I could not get through this episode without at least mentioning it once. I'll stop my ramblings about the song. Please check it out. And I'll take this as an opportunity to transition into what would be the interview for this. I have a really amazing musician coming on this episode. His name is Evon Sams, and I am so excited for all of you to hear what he has to say and learn about his experiences as a musician in the jazz tradition who also plays the saxophone.
So I just relocated to the Chicagoland area, originally from Rockford, and I started a new teaching job like 3 days ago. So
Oh
yeah,
my
I'm
gosh,
very new.
congrats.
Thank you.
Where are you teaching? Like what do you teach specifically?
So I teach elementary band in the south suburbs. So
Oh
it's
my gosh.
it's a new space for me, but it's exciting.
I used to be a nanny, and so I have so much respect for teachers because I struggled with dealing with kids one-on-one. So
Yeah, we got groups of them.
yeah, you really are. So how long have you been studying music then, or working with on your musicality, specifically saxophone?
So I started playing the saxophone in the fifth grade, but that was only because I was like really bad at all of the other instruments when we did like the instrument fitting days. Because originally I wanted to play the flute, but that's the one that was the worst out of everything. So we progressively went through everything, and the saxophone was the only thing that I could get a sound on. But then, like a week later, I got a CD of Grover Washington's greatest hits. I was like, oh, okay, this is pretty cool. I don't sound like that, but at least this is the same instrument. So, like, the capacity to sound like this does exist.
I love that. And then also speaking of music, sort of your experience, you mentioned you have a lot of experience in Black American music, which I've also heard referred to as BAM. And for listeners, that's a term that was coined by Nicholas Payton. Um, and it's often used in replacement of jazz. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. We spoke about it a bit in season one when we had an episode on jazz, and I know everyone feels differently about it and uses the different pieces of terminology differently. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
For sure. For me, BAM is a like all inclusive term. I don't know if I would necessarily use that exact verbiage because that's where, people get into various disputes, right? But I think that the concept of BAM is what's important to understand that um, Black American music is on a continuum. And so instead of trying to define, each thing individually, understanding that they're all actually essentially connected, and just points on a timeline actually help. At least it helps me to understand it differently. So playing a jazz gig for me is no different than playing a gospel gig or playing a hip hop gig or playing an R&B set, because there's a through line through all of them, of the African diaspora and approach to music. So it's essentially like speaking the same language with various dialects.
I love that. In a previous interview I did, it referred to, instead of referring to jazz as a genre, there's the idea of referring to it as a tradition, because it's so much more complex than just like a one specific way of playing music.
Mhm.
Do you sort of agree with that statement at all, or that?
Absolutely. And even thinking in the wider sense, genres can be very limiting, not only to artists and musicians, but even to the general populace to understand what something is, right? So when we talk about jazz specifically, it's kind of funny because I feel like everyone has a definition of like what that is or like what the tradition is. And so since the tradition and the music span such a wide um, timeline and like so many different interpretations of what that means, there have been multiple times where like I was on a jazz gig and ended up playing like traditional New Orleans jazz, and that's it. Or like fusion, and that's it. And people are like confused if you come and play something else. So it's just one of those things in life and in art that is extremely hard to define. So yeah.
I completely agree with that. And then also, speaking of the timeline of jazz, you also in your email to me, you mentioned the phrase jazz is dead. And I've heard that with a lot of different genres of music. We covered that when we spoke about punk rock and rock music. And I've also heard that sort of phrase in reference to jazz. And I thought what you emailed me was incredibly interesting, and I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that and any maybe experiences you have relating to that.
Sweet. Yeah, I have no idea what I said. um But in terms of just understanding like jazz is dead, it's kind of like a colloquialism or like a cliche, right? So, jazz is dead. People don't like good music anymore. There isn't good music being made anymore. Like we hear these things all the time, which are obviously completely untrue. But just seeing a decline or a shift in what was once popular being something else usually like incites that in people's minds. So like of people of a certain generation that grew up with jazz as the traditional popular music of the day, like you would turn the radio on and that's what was playing, would think or assume that jazz is either less relevant or dead because that's no longer the case, right? But since human evolution takes many different turns, now we don't really listen to the radio. Everything is streaming. Other musics have been created and exist now. So just trying to find out where jazz's relevancy is, um, I think is harder to do because it's not as easily accessible as it once was.
And especially with sort of so much music, and I feel like just defining genres is so much harder nowadays with the amount of content that's out there, things blend. Um, but I also want to be able to focus in a little bit on one of your experiences playing jazz music, and sort of because it's a historical podcast. I was really excited when you mentioned this. Your work with the legendary Count Basie Orchestra.
Oh yeah.
I would love to hear you talk about that. Because yeah, when I was studying jazz music in college, he was one of my favorite people to listen to. So,
Y- Yeah, so Count Basie represents, like one of the foundations of the swing tradition. And like even more so, or his influence is felt more than a lot of later bands or even his contemporaries simply because of the way his band like approached playing the music. So like I'm thinking in terms of swing feel and how rhythms feel against a particular pulse was extremely specific to that band, and it was so influential that basically everyone after that references that kind of approach to a swing feel. And so being able to be in that ensemble and read the original charts, which are all still in the book, be on the bandstand with one of the original members and hearing that music played by the band that revolutionized this sound and this style was extremely educational. I learned so much in such a short amount of time. Um, so yeah, just having the opportunity to be that close to the foundations of the music, I think is going to be one of the highlights of my career.
Yeah, and also for listeners out there who might not know, swing music as a genre was one of the first sort of genres of music to really take saxophone seriously as an instrument and to place a lot of priority on saxophone as an instrument and in a band setting, which I thought was a kind of interesting fact to learn. But sort of like relating to swing music a little bit, do you have a specific subsection of, doesn't even have to be jazz, of any music that you love to play or that you feel like really highlights your skills as a musician?
Um, no, but I do. I enjoy having a large range of references. So, like, part of my musical outlook is being as diverse as possible. So, I recently took a polka gig, which was also very educational and just understanding what the nomenclature is, what the form and stuff is, and just creating a larger musical picture. Because for me, I've always heard music like inside of my head. And so trying to communicate it with other people through various genres or various subsections of music just helps me be that much more efficient and articulating, musical practices, because it really comes down to the differences between genres, uh, performance practices, and not notes, not really rhythms, not really harmony. So just being able to navigate multiple spaces is something that I aim to do.
And we sort of also briefly touched on that once again for the listeners out there on our episode about the electric bass, about how it's sort of um part of musicianship is being able to move between genres, and part of having a love of music often extends to a love of multiple different styles of music and not even necessarily thinking of it as subsections, but as a love of sound and music. Um, we're sort of getting a little further along in the podcast, and this is sort of where we get to a little bit more of the educational portion. So are there any experiences if someone was just starting out with saxophone, they've been listening to like Sidney Boucher and like those kind of figures, and they wanted to learn how to play and they wanted to get into it. Um, what advice would you have, or are there any personal experiences you have that could be incredibly educational for someone just learning?
Yeah, for sure. So, for me, most of my education came from listening. Like, the importance of listening can never be stressed enough. I had a professor in grad school by the name of Reggie Thomas that said, "Music is the best teacher of music that I know," which is extremely profound if you think about spending time with music. Which is also something that we don't necessarily do as much anymore because we have other options, right? So we can go to the movies or we can watch Netflix for multiple hours. But to be able to sit down with a record or a style of music and just really listen to it um, will definitely be your best friend. In addition to that, like copying what you're hearing and trying to re articulate it through the instrument is an extremely important skill. It's known as transcribing, where you listen to something and then you copy the notes and copy the style and articulation. The better you're able to do that, the more you'll see your learning curve go. And like most things, once you first start, it's going to be a little difficult and potentially frustrating. But the more you do it, the easier and faster you get at it. So I've spent multiple years just transcribing things that I hear, whether it's on saxophone, piano, or bass, or any of the instruments that I play.
And I would love to hear a little bit about some of the other instruments that you play. We're
Oh,
getting a
okay,
little off topic here,
for
but
sure.
I'm sure the listeners would love to learn more about you. So,
Yeah, so going back to that large musical outlook, I try to diversify and play as many things as possible. So part of my K-12 music educational experience was making sure that I was fluent on all of the traditional European concert band instruments. So trumpet, trombone, uh, French horn, baritone, tuba, and then all the woodwinds, flute, clarinet, saxophone, oboe, bassoon. So all of those instruments, I took classes on the technique of how to play them. So I am functional on them, but I really focus in on the following instruments: flute, clarinet, saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. And that's mostly a time thing because there are only so many hours in the day, and you will only be so good the further you spread your attention. So I find that those are my foundational instruments in terms of writing and in terms of identifying and conceptualizing things for me in music that I'm hearing.
and once again, for listeners, kind of interesting tie over with big band in that a lot of the people who'd write music for big band or swing bands also had a background or an understanding of a lot of those classical European instruments and arrangements, which was aided in the expansion of music within the jazz tradition when it came to adding instruments in. Um, Also focusing on you a little bit, you sent me a really amazing MP3, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about this song that you have coming up.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So this ties in very well, actually. So, as I mentioned before, I've always heard like music in my head, and so when I would hear things on the radio, I would like learn the song the way it was recorded, but I would also hear other musical elements. And so there's a series of projects that I am working on and have worked on that I'm working on rolling out of just popular music, right? So jazz used to be the popular music of the day, where you would turn the radio on and the popular songs that people wrote and were listening to were jazz. So trying to stay true to that part of the tradition, I'm taking popular songs now or songs that have been popular throughout history, and I'm reimagining them through a jazz lens that is extremely individualized to me, mostly because I'm playing each of the instruments on the track. So the track that I sent you, I'm actually playing everything.
And everyone needs to go check that out. I hope you enjoyed that little preview of music. Hi, just jumping in from the editor's booth. Can't believe I didn't say this before, but this was My Cherie Amour by Stevie Wonders. Please, no one come for me for that pronunciation. There's a reason I didn't do well in my French classes. Back to the interview. Is there anything else you would like to shout out or promote? Any projects that are currently out? Social media? Anything you've been enjoying? Even this is your moment. You can take as long as you like for this.
Okay. So yeah, absolutely. I'd love to connect with all of you on social media. You can find me on Facebook at Evon, Evon J Sams. I'm also on Instagram at Evon, Evon J dot Sams. And yeah, I have a Bandcamp page as well, same name. And most of these projects will be coming out either on those platforms or on iTunes or Spotify under that artist name as well. And you can even go to my website at evanjsamsmusic.com.
Amazing, amazing. And before we say goodbye to everyone, is there anything else you would like to add? Any final parting words of wisdom, advice, any fun stories about working in jazz music, or any fun gig stories you have?
Yeah, so I'll tell a brief story. I was playing a restaurant gig fairly recently, and there was this small child. She had to be like, I don't know, anywhere between 3 and 5, that came and sat and danced to our entire 3 hour set without stopping. And her parents tried to like leave because it was 3 hours, and she was so upset. And it was the most adorable thing ever. And it like really let me know, or help solidify the fact that this music is still very relevant, and it's the way that we approach and teach it and introduce it to people that actually matters. So part of my new thing in terms of education, even with my new position, is introducing the kids to music in a non-judgmental way. So if you come to the music with your preconceived notions that this is old, this is bad, you're not supposed to like this, then all of a sudden you taint that person's experience. So allowing people to experience something truly for themselves without interfering at all, I think, excuse me, I think is very important, not only to their overall development as people to be able to make their own choices and decisions without um, always considering the perspectives of other people, but just also broadening their horizons, right? So that when they're introduced to something, they instantly don't have to have an idea about it. They can either just enjoy it or just experience it and decide what they feel or think about it later.
I love
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, 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 continue, continue, continue.
No, that was pretty much it though.
Okay. I think that's so cute. I love the visual of a little 3-year-old girl dancing. And that brings me joy also as a musician who focuses a lot on the old stuff. Um, uh, that take of don't introduce it as being old and boring. Let people learn to love it for the same reasons we do. Um, Thank you so much, Evan. That's it. We're done. We've made it through. You got through the end. You did it. You recorded an episode of Sedelbia Snippets. Thank you once again, Evan, for coming on the show. Everyone, please go check out all his stuff and his music, and you know the drill. I would just like to give a couple of announcements before we end this episode. First of all, I would like to say that we don't have merch, but I am about to release the closest thing the show's ever had to merch. And that is if you are a friend of the show, or if you have been a guest on a previous episode or are going to be a guest on an upcoming episode, I have just finished with the amazing artist Ambrose Reed working on some stickers. And he is the artist who also has done the logo for the show. I will put information about how to find him in the description below. Thank you so much for this awesome art. So once again, if you are a friend of the show or have been on an episode, you can get one of these special edition Sedelbia Snippets stickers that say, "I survived Sedelbia Snippets." Put it on your laptop, hydro flask, car, wherever you put your stickers. And the reason we did this is because, honestly, this show doesn't earn me any money. It's a true passion project of mine to work on this. It's something I love to do, and it's something I will continue doing, whether I make money from it or not. It brings me so much joy to be able to research and learn about these amazing figures and get to interview such awesome people. And it's just my way of showing appreciation to everyone who has helped out a little bit. It's not much, but it's something. New episodes will be out every other Friday. Please continue to check those out. The more you listen, the more I can potentially do with this show. You can also follow me on most social media platforms. I try to post announcements on Instagram primarily, and I am trying to get better about using other platforms, but I honestly can't make any promises. Either way, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye. And actually, last few things that I'm just throwing in right at the end here from the editor's booth. So that's why this whole section is unedited and tagged on at the end. After this episode, we are going to start putting up video versions of the podcast. Those will be available on YouTube. My brother, amazingly, has bought me a camera, so we'll be able to do that. So I'm excited to share that with you. And hopefully the set and everything will get improved as we go along the way. Also, I plan on starting a Kickstarter soon. This money will go towards a 3rd season of Sedelbia Snippets, in which I'll hopefully be able to use it to really up the production quality, maybe bring some more people on, because right now it's just me, and I would love to be able to work with some other amazing people in improving this podcast and making it a more enjoyable experience for all of you. So look forward to that. If you have any ideas for rewards for what to do with the Kickstarter, please let me know. Message me on social media, add it to the poll, or on this, if you're listening on Spotify, comments. You guys know the drill. Actually, bye this time. Bye.